I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at Informa Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 3, Observability in the Age of AI. Austin Parker is a core contributor and community maintainer of the OpenTelemetry open source observability project within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and was among its original founding members in 2019. The project achieved incubation status in 2021 and is close to the final graduation stage of maturity at CNCF. It has emerged as an open standard for collecting telemetry data among observability tools, and the community is working on applying that standard to generative and agentic AI applications. Austin is also the director of open source at observability vendor honeycomb.io. And hello, Austin. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, it's great to be here.
So, you are among the industry experts thinking and writing about what some people call Observability 2.0. Can you summarize what that is for my listeners who aren't familiar and how it might relate to AI applications?
Sure. It's a great question because I think the answer really depends on who you're talking to on any given moment, right? Like
Hmm.
so many things about technology, it gets a little twisted and confused. The thing that I like to focus when we talk about observability 2.0 is actually looking at history, right? And thinking about this progression we've had of how we understand software, how we
Mm-hmm.
understand what computers are doing. Originally, the first thing you do when you learn a new language or open up your new IDE is you have the computer say something to you, right? You do hello world and that
Mm.
console.log, that's print line, it's 10 print, whatever it is. But the first thing that we do when we interact with the system is we say like, hey, hello world, tell me what, log something, right? Give me some output. And it's not really surprising then that so much of how we try to understand systems as they scale, has its genesis in this just idea of like, hey, we're just going to have the computer tell us what it's doing.
Mm.
And that has been really encapsulated with this idea of logging and logging at scale, log aggregation, log collection. There's a million tools to do this. Logs are so critical for everything that we're doing for not just developers, but for system administrators, system operators, security teams, business development. We take that log data, logging what the system's doing, and then translate it into a million different things and use that to try to understand what's going on. But, and this is I think really interesting to bring it back to AI for a second, is AI is itself its own very complex non-deterministic system, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to understand what's going on in the AI, and there's so many different kind of places that you want to do that and have that understanding at. There's how do I understand what's going on when I'm training AI? How do I understand what's going on in an inference task? How do I understand what's going on as part of some agentic system that I'm building, right? And if you think about those 3 different things, those are 3 different things that I named, you actually want slightly different data from each of those. You want to be
Mm-hmm.
able, when you're doing things like training, you're dealing with this like massive sort of fan out, fan in behavior where you're going putting things through various tensors and various algorithms and da 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 da. I am not a machine learning scientist, so I only
Mm-hmm.
casually know this, but you're doing very large operations on a lot of different things, and you're maybe less interested in knowing, when you're trying to operate this, you're less interested in knowing about every single thing that happened, but you're interested in trends. You're interested in things that you can put a number on and these sort of
Mm-hmm.
statistical aggregate trends. So you have metrics for that, right? A special type of telemetry data.
Mm-hmm.
When you're building sort of agentic systems or you're building things where you're really curious about like, hey, the user has made a request and I want to see that request and I want to understand like what are all the parts of that request, then you think that doesn't look quite like a log, that doesn't quite look like a metric, that looks more like a trace of some sort, right? And all of this is very applicable. Where did all that came from? It came from what's happened in the past 20, 30 years of scaling up software systems as we've
Mm-hmm.
gone from I run something on a box in a data center somewhere to I push a button in the AWS console and I get a million boxes in 5 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
We keep adding these new types of telemetry and we keep trying to scale up our understanding of systems as our systems scale up by themselves,
Mm-hmm.
independent of that. As the systems get larger and more complex, we need to be able to kind of reason about them differently. And we can't use just one type of data. We can't
Mm.
rely just on logs. We can't rely just on metrics. We can't rely just on traces. So the idea with Observability 2.0, I think, is instead of looking at these separate signals as independent pillars of data that we're kind of using different tools to look at or analyze. We treat them as a single interconnected pipe, a
Hmm.
single braid or stream of data.
Mm-hmm.
And then we connect that stream. We build relationships between these signals through context. And that
Mm.
context can be anything from these two things happen on the same host at the same time to things that OpenTelemetry lets us do through its distributed context mechanism and say like, hey, here's all the things that were happening, not just in this one, this one service in this one pod or this one node. Here's all the things that happened across my entire system in the context of this one transaction.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of ability, that contextual ability, has made OpenTelemetry, I think, super, super important for AI, and
Mm.
is one of the reasons why we're seeing the AI industry adopt observability as sort of a foundational principle, I think.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I mean, is there anything different about observability for generative AI and agentic AI than what observability tools already do? Is there any adjustment to be made?
I think the interesting thing about like what's different, because there are things that are unique, right? Like one of the bigger things I can think of is that in a traditional sort of, in tier web application where it's pretty easy to fit things in a box, right? Like you kind
Mm.
of know or you expect to know what's going to happen. If I click a button in the front end, it's going to do this and this and this and this and that. And there's a pretty defined order of operations that I can model, use telemetry to sort of verify, to validate that my mental model of what's happening when I click a button is actually happening. With, agentic AI, with generative AI, there is a model, but the actual results can vary wildly. Changing various parameters for an inference request is going to give you very different results. Simple changes, there have been studies done about like simple changes in prompts, right? Like how those influence the output, the tokens that you get back from the model.
Mhm.
And we've seen over just the past year pretty big advances, I would say, in different reasoning styles for models. So we've seen, things like R1, stuff that OpenAI is doing with the O series of models,
Mm.
um, chain of thought in like newer Claude models, right? Where we're moving away from, oh, you have to kind of feed it all of these prompting tricks to, well, the model can just kind of ask itself and do all those prompting tricks for you. So, right, like there's not necessarily an easy like I can take a tracing tool, I can take my standard APM tool and apply
Mm.
that same technique to Gen AI and get the same results. I think this is why you've seen kind of the AI community really coalesce around observability principles, is because they get the ability to start from, I don't want to say start from zero, but they can kind of start from zero and say, well,
Mm.
actually, it's a blend of these things, right? Like we need to focus on, as the people building the AI tools, we need to focus on getting the right data produced, the right descriptive data about what the agent is doing or what the model is doing, or so on and so forth. Get the right data, and then let users kind of figure out what is the best tool or what is the best way to analyze that data.
Right. So is that where semantic conventions come in with OpenTelemetry?
Yeah, a lot of it. So a lot of the
Okay.
idea with open telemetry semantic conventions is when you have data about you want to normalize that data, right? You want to be
Mhm.
able, if you're going to analyze it at scale or you're going to try to teach people how to interpret it, you need to have some sort of standard for what all these things mean. And the idea with the Gen AI semantic conventions and open telemetry is that we're working with people involved in the Gen AI space to sort of develop those conventions in real time. And I think the biggest beneficiary of this isn't necessarily people that are building these models. I think really a lot of it is for the end users of these models, right? So
Mm.
for developers trying to integrate generative AI into their software, being able to have something that kind of says like, "Hey, these are the things that you should care about," sort of encoded in the data and just there, and you can go and like read a document that explains what all these attributes mean, right? What is the
Mm.
temperature mean here? What does amount of tokens mean here? Having that data just in like a consolidated place and people knowing like what it stands for and how it's going to where it's going to appear is
Mhm.
super valuable for the majority of developers, I think. And it prevents you from having to kind of like reinvent the wheel every time you want to go out and you want to do something with generative AI, right? Or you're
Mhm.
so there's benefits on both sides of the equation. If you're the person producing it, you're making the LLM. Now you know, hey, these are the things that I should tell my users about. if you're a new user, or even you're a user switching between like Model A and Model B, right? Like, and you
Mm.
want to compare them, you have an easy way to do that because you have standard telemetry data from all of them now. So you can actually look at and say, well, here's the things that matter, and I can kind of look on these same dimensions across. I can take this same prompt, I can take this same retrieval job, the same classifier or whatever, run it against 5 models, and look at standard output from each of them, and then compare those outputs to say like, well, this one is slightly better at this one's slightly better at that, so on and so forth.
And semantic conventions in OpenTelemetry aren't unique to AI, right? It's just that's the latest thing to update.
Right. Like
Right.
it's definitely where we're focusing, or there's a lot of focus right now because it's
Mhm.
such a fast moving space. But the idea with open telemetry semantic conventions is that that same, that same loop that I just described of having standard data,
Mm.
you would have that for everything from your HTTP servers and clients, your databases,
Mhm.
your message queues, whatever it is. If it's some part of a software system, then we can create semantic conventions for it that help you understand and interpret what your telemetry is doing.
Mm. Okay. And then there's also the topic of instrumentation. There was a blog post in the OpenTelemetry blog this month covering some different opinions about instrumentation for AI agent frameworks. There apparently are some that favor built in telemetry, while others favor publishing instrumentation libraries to GitHub repos externally.
Mhm.
Um, how have you seen that discussion evolve, and do you have a preference yourself?
Oh boy. I think this is one of those challenging. It's a challenging question, right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
think the answer isn't. There's no one answer that works for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, I'm in favor of sort of a hybrid approach where
Okay.
people, let's think about it this way. One of the advantages of open telemetry is that it's trying to give you this sort of standard set of telemetry that you can guarantee is there.
Mm.
A good way to think of a good analogy for this, I think, is that I learned how to drive a car 30 some years ago, give or
Mhm.
take.
Mhm.
It's been a while.
Right.
And when I stepped into that car, there were a couple of different pedals. One of those
Mhm.
pedals doesn't really exist anymore. But there were a few pedals. There was a wheel. There was something to shift the car on, and then in the console, I had speed, gas. Da, da, da. I had
Mhm.
standard ways to interface with the vehicle, and and the vehicle had standard ways to tell me what was important about
Mhm.
operation.
Mhm.
And now, 30 years later, I can step into a car, and for the most part, it's the same.
Mm.
Right? Like, yeah, I could get into something I have an electric vehicle, so there's no, some of those gauges don't exist. Like there's no coolant temperature anymore. There's certainly no
Mm.
gas gauge
Mhm.
anymore, right?
Right.
But there's a speedometer and there's a wheel and there's
Mm.
something that lets me tell the car go or park, right?
Right.
So the modalities have changed and some of the details have changed, but the basic interface is the same. And someone older, even older than I am, is able to step into a modern electric vehicle and still drive it and still
Mm.
understand how it operates.
Mhm.
I think that when you think about like open telemetry and what is the benefit open telemetry gives you, it's really that it's that sort of like minimum amount of detail you need that is consistent across all types of applications, all types of services, all types of whatever, so
Mm.
that when you go and you look at like a new system or you look at something you're not familiar with, you're able to say like, "Oh, I know where to go looking for something because it's in a conventional place. It has a
Mhm.
conventional shape.
Mhm.
It's standardized."
Mm.
And having that sort of automatic instrumentation experience where things are just like built in, you run a program or you add some config or you just turn something on. I mean, however you get it in there, having that default experience be like, here's telemetry and it's just coming out of the application and I didn't have to do anything.
Right.
I think that's really valuable.
Mhm.
Some people, are a bit more performance minded, right? Then there's the people that it's like, okay, well, I don't need that, right? Like, I don't
Yeah.
want that because I have different considerations than you do. And so
Mhm.
I think and I think to go back to my analogy, there is one type of car that I could not do this in. I could not get into like an F1 car
You're right.
and drive it.
Uh-huh.
If you've
Right.
ever seen the steering wheel on those things, it's like 40.
Yeah.
Knowing how to drive a vehicle does not mean I can drive a hyper specialized vehicle
Right.
because
Right.
and I think that's a general way to conceptualize this stuff. When
Mhm.
you get to the point where you're making these like really extreme trade-offs in favor of performance,
Mm.
then yeah, your experience is going to look different than maybe a mass market thing.
Mhm.
However, we accept this trade-off in life. We accept that like hyper specialized high performance tools are going to work differently than like the mass model stuff,
Mhm.
and we say that's fine. That's an acceptable trade-off for the benefits you get with the higher performance options. And I think you're
Mhm.
going to see similar that to me is like really where this argument, the middle line as it were.
Mhm.
When you're on one side of that, when you're on the I just need a minivan, I just need to get from point A to point B,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with having a minivan, they're great.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's all you need though, right? You need the minivan and sometimes you need the F1 car.
Yeah.
And I fundamentally don't believe that it's good for us as a project. And I also don't think the user community expects that we always optimize around the high performance F1 car, right?
Right.
Like as a kind of an aside, one of the things that's definitely happened with the open source movement over the past, 20 years, 10 years at least, is definitely there is a much stronger expectation from the user community that open source is treated not just as a project, but as a product.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
part of being a product is making decisions like that, right? Like which one of these things do you, maybe not excluding one thing, right? Like with open source, you can't really fire your customers,
Mhm. Mhm.
but you can say like we're going to prioritize X over Y. And I think we've made the deliberate decision, and we'll probably continue to make this, that we need to think about the people who want minivans more so than we think about the people that want F1 cars. We don't exclude those people, but it's open source after all. You can go
Right.
and you can do whatever you want to it. But perhaps that's not like the golden path.
Mhm.
And I think as the project continues to mature, we'll see more we'll see more people kind of building towards those high performance ends. Like I know I was actually talking to someone in the Gen AI community recently who was very interested in like, hey, how can we get like super high performance open telemetry data, through Python using like Rust bindings, right? Because they
Mm.
have this very complex training and inference chain that calls from Python into Rust and da 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 da. Da. And I was talking through it with them, and it's like it's possible. It's you have to go write some code.
Right.
It's not something that we just kind of offer out of the box as a project. Reasonable people can kind of agree or disagree about like what is the appropriate prioritization for it.
Mhm.
I would strongly encourage anyone that has feelings to come and open an issue, open a PR.
Right.
And if it's something that speaks to you a lot, then there's people that would love to see more iteration, more development there.
Right. And
You could be the first.
speaking of being built in, do any of those newer agentic AI frameworks try to build in their own observability approach? Or do they look to an existing standard like OpenTelemetry?
We've mostly seen people coalesce around open telemetry. There's
Hmm.
a few, I don't want to name names, but
Huh.
there's been a few large-ish vendors that are kind of seem to be trying to do their own thing.
Mhm.
I think people are, users are users and customers are the ones whose voices matter here, right? Like I could sit here and say whatever I wanted about people that are building or not building open telemetry into their project products.
Mhm. Right.
But ultimately, what we've seen as a project and what I think we see as an industry is that
Mm.
companies will build, like vendors will build what their customers want,
Mhm.
and what their customers need. So if you go and you say, "Hey, I want Hotel, I want Hotel, I want Hotel," they'll build Hotel.
Right.
If you don't say that, then they won't. So,
Right.
but for the most part, I would say we're seeing more and more people coalesce around open telemetry, and not just in the Gen AI space, right? Like I think a
Mhm.
really exciting development that's happened recently. It's a little off to, maybe not off topic, but it's a little aside. Is Dino, the JavaScript runtime,
Mhm.
have in their recent 2.0 release or 2.1, 2.2, either way, they natively integrate OpenTelemetry into Dino.
Mhm.
So if you're using Dino and you want OTel, then it's literally just you turn on an environment variable and it works,
Mhm.
right? Which I think is thrilling because it makes it so much easier as a developer to sort of integrate this. And if you're, one of the things that I see a lot of people talk about when it comes to like agentic AI, is this idea of TypeScript being the lingua franca
Hmm.
for for AI development because
Huh.
it's easy to build, it's easy to run, the models know a lot about it, it's well
Mm.
documented. There's a lot of a lot of niceties to
Hmm.
TypeScript. Well, Dino
Mhm.
supports TypeScript natively, so you can, I've been on a real vibe coding kick
Uh-huh.
lately. Me and everyone else, right? But I've been using Claude Code a lot, and
Uh-huh.
it makes you really think differently about how you're developing and about like the feedback loops that you're trying to create. And so being able
Mm.
to have something like Dino that has native OTel in it and being able to tell Claude like, "Hey, here's what I want you to do," and then telling it, "Oh, and turn this on." And now you're going to get traces, and you can use this tool to go into some observability tool and like look at those traces or like search through them and do analysis on them, like, is a really nice feedback loop for development.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that about TypeScript. I've heard about a strong association with, Python and AI apps, but not
Yeah, a
TypeScript.
lot of Python too.
Mhm.
Definitely if you're building a lot of the stuff around like inference and
Mm.
training things and really getting kind of low level,
Mhm.
then Python is kind of language of choice, and that's where we
Mm.
see most of like the I would say the overwhelming majority of like the Gen AI efforts in OTel are focused on Python right now.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of like applications, like if you're writing apps with AI or you're writing AI agents, I find TypeScript to be a really great choice.
Why is that?
I think for the reasons that I already said,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
mostly the thing that I think is actually really useful about it is what I've found when what I found with doing like development with AI especially is the three things that are kind of like the things that are like really really important is one is really really fast cycle time.
Mm.
2 is, like, really lightweight tool chains and
Mm.
the ability to, like, quickly have a sort of a REPL thing, right? Read, evaluate, print, da, 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 da. You
Mhm.
wanna be able to have something that's like, "Okay, I can build this quickly." It has types, and it has, like, really strict enough type systems so that when I build something, like, the AI is gonna be able to understand, like, "Oh, I did the wrong thing,"
Ah,
right?
okay.
Like you need to be, and having a type system is really handy for that because it means that it's not going to try to pass the wrong thing into the wrong, it's not going to try to give foos to the bar collection.
Yeah.
And it can check that at build time versus at runtime. And then three is that there's just a lot of like, this is kind of a weird one, but like the delta between like the TypeScript of a couple years ago and the TypeScript of
Mm.
today is smaller, I think, than the
Ah,
delta between like 5 to 7 year old Java code and modern Java code.
right.
So there's a certain amount of like just with the way that the semantic search works, the less diffs I guess there have been in like a language or in the keywords or in the
Mm.
syntax or whatever, more likely it is that your AI coding assistant is going to be able to give you accurate, working code on a without
Mm.
having to sit and spin a lot.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Like I could be wrong. That's
Uh-huh.
where I've had a lot of luck. I've had a lot of luck in like
Sure.
in the more lightweight languages. But
Right.
I've also found that it's pretty good at most things these days. So
Right. Yeah, but that's interesting. It's almost its own kind of semantic convention on the coding side in a way.
yeah, it's definitely it's a super it's there's a lot of innovation happening. It's very very to be like a little real with it for a second.
Hmm.
I do think it's going to pretty dramatically change like the software industry from like
Mm.
a jobs perspective.
Mhm.
If you think about what the value of being able to write code, I think is going down.
Hmm.
Now, conversely, I think the value of like understanding systems and design patterns and like how to build scalable systems is going up significantly.
Mm. Mhm. Yep.
So it's not zero. It's not necessarily zero sum,
Mhm.
but it's definitely going to have like a pretty profound impact, I think, on writing software as a job moving
Yeah.
forward.
I mean, what do you see in terms of that over the next year or so? Is that too soon to see that kind of change?
I think, yeah, like I mean, I see this as being like a very long tail sort of thing,
Yeah.
right? Like one thing that isn't necessarily, that I don't think people have really grappled with is the economics of this are not as cut and dry as we would like to think.
Hmm.
Agentic AI, I think, is a great example of this, where like doing anything. fast and well is pretty expensive at list prices, right? Like
Yeah.
I can very easily spend, I don't know, like I'm thinking I've been building a demo application for KubeCon to show off
Mhm.
some new hotel features, and I've been doing it mostly through Claude Code, 95% of the work, right? And so,
Mhm.
which is nice, because it means that I can kind of do stuff while I'm doing other stuff. It's
Right.
actually like I can just, start out by saying like, well, here's a design, here's some UML, here's what I want you to do. Go off and do stuff, and it does
Mhm.
stuff, and I have to talk to it and go back and forth. But because it's doing most of the work, I'm able to do other things. I'm able to
Mhm.
reply onto emails or
Mhm.
catch up on GitHub issues or whatever it is. I'm doing other work. So it's been able to let me multiplex my time. But I would easily say, like, I've probably, this is a toy. It's not a toy. It's not necessarily a toy app, but it's not necessarily like super complex either. And it's probably gone through like a couple $100 over the course of like 2 weeks in terms of
Mhm.
API costs.
Mm.
And that to me is like, I mean, work's paying for it, so
Right. Yeah.
technically we have credits.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I do think that's like that to me is a very different sort of, when you look at like how people are pricing these sort of agentic features or whatever in the market right now, I don't
Mhm.
think they bear a lot of they don't necessarily bear out with reality.
Huh.
Something like Cursor for just like 20 a month or whatever. The problem is that the traditional SaaS approach of like, oh, I'm gonna make it up on volume because as I get more people, my unit cost goes down. Like that works for Anthropic and that works for OpenAI, but that doesn't work for middlemen because
Mm.
there's no, if you're Cursor or Windsurf or you're any of these sort of like in between
Mm.
providers, what's your value add? What is the thing that the more people that use you actually keeps other people out or like locks them in? And not even locks them in, but just like where is your moat, right? Like you aren't getting the more people that use you, the more you end up paying to a variety of other AI inference providers.
Mm.
And I think again, it's very much like what we've seen with the cloud in the past. At some point, the cost per million tokens is going to get down to the point where it's a commodity.
Mhm.
Similar to how there's not a huge amount of daylight between like between how much does it cost to run an instance in AWS or Azure or
Mhm.
GCP or Oracle or whoever, right?
Right.
Like infrastructure is a commodity. I think LLMs will also become a commodity.
Mm.
And so if your business right now is just sitting in between users and a model, eh, like
Right.
that's the sort of stuff that feels like we're gonna shake out over the next year.
Yeah.
Is okay, the tech is here, people are getting value out of it. It is starting to have some transformative impacts, but who is actually going to be able to make a business out of this stuff? That is a much bigger question.
Mm.
I think, and you definitely see this at the high end too, right? You see this with some of the rumors about OpenAI and what they're going to be charging for very advanced, agentic
Uh-huh.
ish stuff. I've seen numbers and the hundreds of thousands of dollars,
Wow.
per head.
Oh
Uh,
my.
but they're saying this replaces like a PhD, right? Like that
Huh.
that's the level of intelligence for those that because podcasting is a famously visual medium. I made air quotes around intelligence.
Right.
But I think there's a big gulf right now. There's a big like businessy gulf right now that nobody
Mhm.
really has cracked. There's
Yeah.
obvious value in LLMs for many, many, many things.
Mhm.
There is a big question of how do you actually, where is the actual value, right? Like I
Mm.
think you're going to see more people, open source models I think are extremely impressive. I think the stuff we've seen from like
Mm.
DeepSeek is
Mhm.
super impressive. A lot of the things that are just like the truisms and common wisdoms about the space have not necessarily held up.
Mm.
We're still in a rapid innovation cycle and
Right.
we will continue to see rapid innovation. And at some point, the question becomes like, if I can do the things I care about just on device, if I don't need to use OpenAI, if I don't need to go and pay someone else to run these things, I can just run it on a GPU at home.
Mhm.
How much do I need? Like, do I need Claude code to go back through Anthropic, or can I just run something that's good enough locally? These are good. These are
Hmm.
questions that we don't have answers to.
Yeah.
Uh, And I think we'll get them, eventually we will get the answers. I think that's gonna be kind of the next 12 months is gonna be a lot of getting the answers and
Mhm.
seeing, like, who is really able to who's able to make something out of this? Who is able to find something that's not just, like, a chat interface over your data or da 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 da.
Right.
The space is incredibly open, and there's a ton of room,
Yeah.
I think, for actual innovative ideas. We just haven't seen a lot of them yet because the low hanging fruit is the easy stuff, and that's where we're at still, the low hanging fruit.
So in that same time frame over the next year, what do you think is the next frontier for OTel in terms of observability or AI or both? What's the
Mm.
next job there?
Yeah, I think we're talking about that right now. We're trying to. One thing we do each summer is we kind of go through and we sit down and we do a sort of look back, look forward, and plan a roadmap. And that process usually starts around this time of year.
Mm,
KubeCon EU coming up here in a few weeks.
right.
So I think there's really two big pillars of work that I think we're interested in accomplishing over the next year or so. One of them is getting better about finishing things, getting better about getting stuff done,
Hmm.
closing out projects, and actually
Mm.
completing stuff. There's a few projects that we're actually very close to getting there. So one
Mm.
being a good example is a declarative configuration standard for OpenTelemetry. So there'll be a rather than having to kind of go through and have the a million different environment variables, there'll be a single,
Hmm.
well documented, well understood way to configure OpenTelemetry across all languages.
Cool.
Another thing that we're trying to get out the door is this idea is I was just talking to some people about this actually. This idea of events, which
Mm.
I think there's a lot of consternation around that word. Events are just structured logs.
Yeah.
So we started at the end, we started at traces, and now we're getting all the way back to logging. But a lot
Hmm.
of our initial assumptions about logs and their role, I don't think necessarily held up when we started talking to people more and getting this into the hands of folks. And so we've definitely found there's a need for a, first class OTel logging API. And there's also a need for a first class idea of not just semantic conventions for like metadata about, metadata on a span or metadata, labels on a metric, but also just the idea of like there are just things that happen that we need semantic conventions for those too, and those would be
Mm.
events.
Mm.
So I'm pretty hopeful that that is getting to the point where it can be stabilized and we can get that out into people's hands. And in terms of what's next, I don't know. I think a lot of it is, I think the next big thing after we kind of finish what's in progress, then so the other pillar
Mm-hmm.
is really around trying to make it easier to use OTel for
Mm.
developers. And I think this
Right.
is actually a place that generative AI and especially AI coding assistant is going to be very important because
Mm.
I really am interested in how the industry can how we can teach models about observability, how we can teach them about how to use open telemetry and write better instrumentation, write better logging, write better metrics, write better traces,
Right.
both for net new development, but also to help people migrate, right? Help people take their existing code that kind of like has poor observability. How can we teach a model what good observability looks like and have the model re-instrument some application or some service with open telemetry?
Yeah.
So that I think is going to be both something that we see people on the industry side get into, but also I think it's something that we're going to probably look into more on the OTel, on the open
Mm.
source side of how can we get our documentation to be better for LLMs is a
Ah.
good example of this because it's a documentation meant for an LLM is different than documentation meant for a human. So we have
Right.
to that's stuff that has to be written, or you have to be able to tell the LLM to go write the docs about it, and then
Right. Yeah.
right. So those I think are really the pillars, though, is sort of finishing up all this stuff in progress and getting things stable and getting things in people's hands,
Mm-hmm.
and then the second is making it easier to use, making it better, making it more delightful. Really, if focusing on developer experience and contributor experience as well. Like
Right.
the project is very large. We would like to continue to make sure that it continues to grow in a healthy way. We would like to continue to make sure that we get new leaders in, we get people coming in to, you know, like we said at the top, I've been doing this since 2019
Mm-hmm.
and before. Like at some point, it'd be great to take a vacation.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. Well, for now, you still have plenty ahead of you, but I appreciate you taking the time out of that to chat with us about what's going on. And thanks for a great conversation as always.
Thanks for having me. It was wonderful talking to you.
Likewise, good to talk to you again. This has been IT Ops Query Season 3 Observability in the Age of AI. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at beth.pariseau, that's PARISEAU, at informatechtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice, and tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about how observability is shaping AI and how AI is shaping observability.